The smell of salt and desperation hung heavy in the air at Port Royal's weathered docks. Isabella Crane hadn't eaten in 3 days, her worn dress hanging loose on her thin frame, as she approached the notorious crew of the Black Serpent. Their captain, Thorne Blackwater, was known throughout the Caribbean as a man without mercy. His dark eyes had seen countless battles, and his scarred hands had taken more lives than most men had yielded. When Isabella begged for work, any work, to keep from starving, Thorne's cruel laughter echoed across the harbor. "Only job here is wife in my cabin," he snarled, expecting her to flee in shame like all the others. Instead, something sparked in her green eyes, something that made his crew fall silent and his own heart skip a beat. But what happens when desperation meets determination, and a pirate discovers that some treasures can't be stolen? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Caribbean sun beat mercilessly down on Port Royal's bustling harbor, where the scent of exotic spices mingled with the less pleasant aromas of unwashed sailors and rotting fish. It was here, in this den of commerce and corruption, that Captain Thorne Blackwater held court among the most feared pirates of the Spanish Main. At 35, he commanded respect through a reputation built on ruthless efficiency and an absolute unwillingness to show weakness to anyone, for any reason. Thorne's ship, the Black Serpent, lay anchored in the deeper waters beyond the main harbor, her black hull and blood-red sails serving as a warning to merchant vessels throughout the Caribbean. She was a predator among sheep, designed for speed and intimidation in equal measure. Her captain reflected these qualities in his own bearing, tall and lean, with dark hair that caught the sunlight and eyes the color of storm clouds before they unleashed their fury. The tavern where Thorne conducted his business dealings was called the Siren's Rest, an establishment that catered to men who lived by violence and died young. The proprietor, a former pirate named Samuel Briggs, had lost his leg to a Spanish cutlass but retained enough cunning to create a neutral ground where even enemies could drink without immediately killing each other. It was a delicate balance maintained through careful diplomacy and the understood threat of being permanently banned from the only place in Port Royal where a man could get decent rum and reliable information. Thorne sat at his usual table in the corner, positioned to observe both entrances while keeping his back to a solid wall. His crew of 20 men occupied the surrounding tables, creating an informal barrier between their captain and the rest of the tavern's patrons. They were hard men, selected not just for their fighting abilities, but for their unwavering loyalty to a captain who had made them wealthy and kept them alive through 3 years of successful piracy. James Fletcher, his first mate, was a grizzled veteran of countless sea battles, whose loyalty to Thorne had been earned through shared dangers and mutual respect. At 42, Fletcher possessed the tactical mind that complemented Thorne's natural leadership, making them a formidable partnership in both planning raids and executing them with precision. Hidden in Thorne's private quarters aboard the Black Serpent lay a tattered document that told a different story about their captain's past, his original commission as a lieutenant in His Majesty's Royal Navy. The papers, yellowed with age and bearing the official seal of the Admiralty, revealed that Thorne Blackwater had once been Thomas Blackwater, a promising young officer whose tactical brilliance had earned him rapid promotion through the ranks. The commission papers detailed his service record, including several commendations for valor and strategic thinking that had saved British lives and secured victories against Spanish forces. But those days were long buried beneath years of betrayal and disillusionment. The idealistic young naval officer had died the day his superior officers had used him as a scapegoat for their own failures, stripping him of rank and leaving him to face court-martial for crimes he had not committed. Thorne had chosen exile over disgrace, taking his skills and his anger to the lawless waters, where such things were assets rather than liabilities. Isabella Crane was 23 years old, though recent hardships had aged her beyond her years. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple braid that revealed the fine bone structure of her face, and her green eyes held an intelligence that had served her well during better times. She had been born to a merchant family in Bristol, educated in languages and mathematics, and raised with the expectation of a comfortable marriage to a man of suitable station. Those expectations had died with her father in a storm off the Bahamas 6 months earlier. His ship, carrying both his fortune and his family's future, had gone down with all hands except for the handful of survivors who had brought word of the disaster to Port Royal. Isabella had sold everything she possessed to book passage to the Caribbean, hoping to salvage something from her father's business relationships. Instead, she had discovered that maritime commerce was an unforgiving profession that offered little sympathy to the children of failed merchants. Her last coins had been spent on a week's lodging at a boarding house that catered to respectable women of modest means. When that money ran out, Isabella had found herself facing the harsh reality that Port Royal offered limited opportunities for young women without family or funds. The choices were stark: find employment quickly or face starvation on streets that showed no mercy to the weak or naive. For 3 days, Isabella had searched for work suitable for a woman of her education and background. The responses had been uniformly discouraging. Merchants wanted clerks with local connections and established reputations. Ship owners needed sailors with experience and physical strength. Even the more modest establishments required references that Isabella could not provide. The Siren's Rest represented her last hope for finding employment that might allow her to survive long enough to develop a more permanent solution to her circumstances. The single word hung in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. The entire tavern had fallen into a silence so complete that the sound of waves against the harbor's piling seemed unnaturally loud. Thorne's crew stared at Isabella with expressions ranging from shock to admiration, while the other patrons of the Siren's Rest watched the unfolding drama with the fascination of spectators at a gladiatorial contest. Thorne himself felt something he had not experienced in years: genuine surprise. In his 3 decades of life, 15 of which had been spent among the most unpredictable and dangerous men in the Caribbean, he had become expert at anticipating human behavior. People faced with his particular combination of threat and opportunity typically responded in predictable ways, with fear, anger, attempts at negotiation, or dignified retreat. No one had ever simply accepted his deliberately outrageous terms with such calm directness. Isabella stood before him with her chin raised and her hands steady at her sides, showing no sign of the trembling that would have been natural for someone in her position. In that moment, she slipped the last valuable possession from her finger, her mother's simple gold wedding ring, worn thin by years of wear, but still bearing the delicate engraving of roses that had been her family's symbol. She had planned to pawn it that very afternoon if no other option presented itself, but now it seemed that fate had provided a different path entirely. "Very well then," Thorne said slowly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made seasoned pirates shift uncomfortably in their seats. "If you're so eager to join my crew under those particular terms, let's see how you handle your first test." He gestured toward the tavern's main door, where a commotion had begun to develop. 3 Spanish merchants had entered, their fine clothing and nervous glances immediately marking them as outsiders who had wandered into decidedly hostile territory. They were clearly lost, probably seeking the more respectable establishments that catered to legitimate traders rather than the pirates and smugglers who frequented the Siren's Rest. "Those gentlemen appear to be in need of directions," Thorne continued, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. "Why don't you go assist them? Let's see how well those language skills serve you when the stakes are higher than polite conversation." Isabella understood immediately that this was no simple test of translation ability. The way Thorne's crew had begun to position themselves around the tavern, the subtle shift in their postures from relaxed drinking to alert readiness, told her that these merchants represented opportunity of the kind that pirates were always seeking. She was being asked to participate in what would likely be her first criminal act, using her education and refinement to help separate these men from their money or information. The moral weight of the decision settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. 6 months ago, she would have been horrified at the thought of participating in any scheme to defraud honest merchants. But 6 months ago, she had been secure in her father's house, with a full belly and a warm bed, never having faced the reality of choosing between survival and respectability. Now, with hunger gnawing at her stomach and no other prospects for employment, Isabella found herself walking toward the Spanish merchants with a composure that surprised even her. She had crossed the line the moment she accepted Thorne's terms, and there would be no returning to the innocence of her former life. "Buenos dias, señores," she said in perfect Castilian Spanish, her accent refined enough to suggest noble breeding. "I couldn't help but notice that you seem to be searching for something. Perhaps I might be of assistance." Saldest of the three merchants, a man with graying temples and the soft look of someone who had never missed a meal, brightened immediately at hearing his native language spoken with such cultured precision. "Ah, señorita, how fortunate to meet someone civilized in this establishment," he replied, casting a nervous glance around the tavern. "We are seeking the offices of Señor Martinez, who handles shipping arrangements for merchants seeking passage to Havana. We were told he could be found near the harbor, but these streets all look the same." Isabella smiled with the practiced charm she had learned in her father's drawing room, while her mind raced through the implications of what she had just learned. These merchants were seeking transport to Havana, which meant they likely carried sufficient funds to pay for such passage. They were also clearly unfamiliar with Port Royal's geography and customs, making them ideal targets for the kind of sophisticated confidence schemes that educated criminals could execute. "I'm afraid Señor Martinez relocated his offices just last week," Isabella replied smoothly, the lie flowing from her lips with surprising ease. "However, I happen to know of an excellent Captain Blackwater here." She gestured toward Thorne with a graceful movement. "Operates one of the finest vessels in the Caribbean trade. I'm certain he would be delighted to discuss passage arrangements with gentlemen of your obvious refinement." The Black Serpent cut through the Caribbean waters with the grace of a predator born to hunt. Isabella stood at the bow, her hair whipping in the salt-tinged wind, watching dolphins race alongside their wake. 3 days had passed since she had stepped aboard as the newest and most unusual member of Thorne's crew, and the transformation in her circumstances seemed as dramatic as the endless horizon that stretched before them. Her quarters were indeed in the captain's cabin, as Thorne had promised, though the arrangements had proven far more civilized than his crude proposition had suggested. Thorne had given her privacy behind a canvas partition, along with a small writing desk, where she had begun to document their journey. The ship's logbook lay open before her each evening, its leather binding worn smooth by countless hands, but now bearing her elegant script alongside the rough notations of previous entries. The contrast was striking, where previous logkeepers had scrawled brief utilitarian notes about wind direction and supplies consumed. Isabella found herself recording detailed observations about weather patterns, crew dynamics, and the subtle politics of pirate life. Her educated hand transformed the mundane record-keeping into something resembling a maritime journal that future historians might actually find readable. "Wind steady from the southeast, seas calm with moderate swells," she wrote in her careful script. "Crew morale remains high following successful negotiation with Spanish merchants in Port Royal. Captain Blackwater's tactical approach to commerce continues to prove both profitable and surprisingly diplomatic." She had learned to phrase things diplomatically in her writings, understanding that the ship's log might someday be examined by authorities who would not appreciate detailed accounts of piracy and fraud. But Isabella also knew that she was documenting something significant: the evolution of a pirate crew that operated with more intelligence and restraint than most, led by a captain whose background had given him strategic advantages that typical pirates lacked. The crew's initial skepticism about her presence had begun to fade as they witnessed her practical value during their encounter with the Spanish merchants. Her ability to conduct negotiations in flawless Spanish, combined with her obvious education and refinement, had allowed them to extract nearly 3 times the usual fee for passage to a destination they had no intention of reaching. The merchants had been left safely in Nassau, with a story about pirates forcing them to change their travel plans, technically true if incomplete. "She's got a head for this business," James Fletcher had commented to Thorne after counting their unexpected windfall. "Most people with her breeding would have fainted at the first sign of dishonesty. This one adapts like she was born to it." Isabella had overheard the conversation and felt a complex mixture of pride and unease. She was indeed adapting to pirate life with a facility that surprised even her, but each successful deception seemed to carry her further from the person she had been raised to become. The woman who had walked into the Siren's Rest 3 days ago would have been horrified by some of the thoughts that now seemed perfectly reasonable. The first real test of her resolve came during their second day at sea, when the weather began to deteriorate with frightening speed. Isabella had never experienced a Caribbean storm from the deck of a ship, and the sudden transformation of calm seas into towering walls of water left her both terrified and exhilarated. "All hands on deck." Thorne's voice cut through the howling wind like a blade. "Secure the rigging and prepare for heavy weather." Isabella watched the crew spring into action with the precision of men who had faced such storms countless times before. But she also noticed that several of them glanced toward the cabin where she had taken shelter, clearly wondering how their refined passenger would handle her first taste of the sea's fury. Instead of cowering below deck as they expected, Isabella emerged from the cabin and approached the nearest crew member struggling with a stubborn sail line. "Show me what to do," she said simply. The sailor, a weathered man named Marcus with arms like twisted rope, stared at her in amazement. "Miss, this ain't work for a lady. You'll be hurt or worse." "I'll be hurt worse if this ship goes down because I was too delicate to help save it," Isabella replied, grabbing the line with both hands. "Teach me." For the next 4 hours, Isabella worked alongside the crew as they battled the storm's fury. Her hands became raw from handling rough rope. Her dress was soaked through and torn in several places, and she had never been more exhausted in her life. But she had also never felt more alive, more connected to her own capabilities than during those desperate hours when survival depended on everyone working together regardless of their background or previous station in life. When the storm finally broke and the Black Serpent emerged into calmer waters, Isabella stood among Thorne's crew as an equal for the first time. Her elegant handwriting that evening recorded not just the technical details of their passage through the storm, but her own transformation from passenger to crew member. The Spanish merchant vessel San Carlos rode low in the water, her holds heavy with silver from the Potosí mines, and her crew blissfully unaware that they were being stalked by predators. Isabella crouched behind the Black Serpent's mainmast, her heart pounding as she watched Thorne position his ship for what would be her first real pirate raid. "Remember," Thorne said quietly, his eyes never leaving the Spanish vessel, "we're traders who've encountered engine trouble. You'll do the talking until we're close enough to make our real intentions clear." Isabella nodded, trying to steady her breathing as she prepared to use her education and refinement as weapons of deception. In her hands she clutched a golden crucifix that had belonged to the San Carlos's captain, though she didn't know that yet. Within the hour it would be torn from the dying man's neck as he pleaded for mercy that would not come. The approach required delicate timing, too aggressive, and the Spanish crew would have time to prepare defenses or signal for help. Too cautious, and they might escape into waters where pursuit would be impossible. Thorne had explained the strategy during their planning session, his tactical mind breaking down the raid into precise steps that would minimize risk while maximizing their chances of success. "Signal them," Thorne commanded. Isabella stepped forward, visible now to the Spanish crew, and called out in her most refined Castilian accent, "Hola, tenemos problemas con nuestro barco. Necesitamos ayuda." The response came quickly, as Thorne had predicted. Spanish merchants were notorious for their willingness to assist fellow Catholics in distress, particularly when the request came from someone who spoke their language with obvious nobility. The San Carlos adjusted course to bring them alongside the Black Serpent, her captain clearly intending to offer whatever assistance he could provide. Isabella continued the deception as the ships drew closer, explaining their fictional mechanical troubles with the fluency and conviction that only genuine education could provide. She spoke of damaged rigging and a cracked mast, technical details she had learned during her weeks aboard the Black Serpent, delivered with the distressed gratitude of someone who had feared being stranded at sea. "You're a natural at this," Fletcher whispered admiringly as they watched the Spanish crew prepare to throw lines across the gap between the vessels. But Isabella felt sick to her stomach. These were honest merchants, probably family men with wives and children waiting for their return to Cartagena or Sevilla. They were risking their own safety to help strangers in distress, motivated by the same Christian charity that Isabella had been raised to value above all other virtue. The moment of truth came when the ships were lashed together, and the Spanish captain, a dignified man with silver hair and kind eyes, stepped aboard the Black Serpent to assess their supposed damage. "I am Capitan Rodriguez," he said warmly, extending his hand to Thorne. "How may we assist you, friends?" Thorne's response was swift and brutal. His pistol appeared in his hand as if by magic, the barrel pressed against Rodriguez's temple before the Spanish captain could react. "By surrendering your cargo without resistance," Thorne said calmly. "This is a raid, Capitan, not a rescue." The transformation of Rodriguez's expression from helpful concern to shocked betrayal cut through Isabella like a knife. She watched the man's face crumble as he realized that his Christian charity had led him and his crew into mortal danger. What followed was a masterclass in efficient piracy. Thorne's crew swarmed aboard the San Carlos with practiced precision, securing the Spanish sailors before they could mount any meaningful resistance. The few who attempted to fight were quickly overwhelmed, their weapons knocked from their hands by men who had perfected the art of violent intimidation. Isabella found herself translating Thorne's demands to the Spanish crew, her refined accent now serving to make their surrender seem somehow more civilized than it actually was. She watched crates of silver being transferred to the Black Serpent while Spanish sailors knelt on their own deck, hands bound behind their backs, eyes filled with the helpless rage of men who had been betrayed by their own decency. The golden crucifix came from Capitan Rodriguez himself, torn from his neck when he made the mistake of reaching for it while pleading for his crew's lives. The religious artifact was beautiful, carved with exquisite detail by some master craftsman, probably a gift from his wife or daughter to protect him during his dangerous voyages. "Please," Rodriguez begged in Spanish, his dignified composure finally cracking. "The silver belongs to the crown, but my crew are simple sailors with families to feed. Show mercy to them, I beg you." Isabella translated his words, though her voice nearly failed her as she spoke. Thorne listened impassively, then gave orders that surprised everyone present. "Tell him his crew will live," Thorne said quietly. "We'll leave them enough supplies to reach the nearest port, but the silver comes with this." It was more mercy than most pirates would have shown, but Isabella still felt the weight of moral compromise settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. The evening air was perfumed with cinnamon and nutmeg, as Isabella and Thorne shared their meal in the privacy of his cabin. She had prepared the simple fare herself, using exotic spices acquired during their recent raid to transform basic ship's provisions into something approaching civilized dining. The intimate ritual had developed naturally over the past weeks, becoming a daily opportunity for conversation that went far beyond the practical matters of pirate life. "You handled yourself well today," Thorne said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Rodriguez was impressed with your Spanish. Said you spoke like nobility." Isabella paused with her fork halfway to her mouth, considering the irony of receiving compliments on her breeding from the same man she had just helped to rob. "My tutor would be horrified to learn how I'm using her lessons. Tell me about her, about your life before." Thorne's request was casual, but Isabella had learned to recognize the deeper interest behind his seemingly offhand questions. She found herself describing her childhood in Bristol, the comfortable house overlooking the harbour where her father conducted his shipping business, the afternoon lessons with Senora Martinez, who had insisted that a proper young lady must speak French and Spanish with perfect fluency. As she talked, Isabella realized this was the first time she had spoken of her past without the crushing weight of loss that usually accompanied such memories. "You miss it," Thorne observed, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "I miss the certainty of it," Isabella replied thoughtfully. "Knowing who I was supposed to be, what was expected of me. Everything was planned out, the suitable marriage, the comfortable life, the predictable future. It was confining, but it was safe." Thorne reached across the small table and touched her hand briefly, a gesture so gentle that it seemed completely at odds with his fearsome reputation. "And now? Now I don't know who I'm supposed to be, but I'm beginning to discover who I might choose to become." The conversation continued long into the night, ranging across topics that Isabella had never imagined discussing with anyone, let alone a pirate captain. Thorne spoke of his naval service with a mixture of pride and bitterness, describing battles where his tactical brilliance had saved British lives and secured victories that other officers had claimed credit for. "I was young enough to believe that merit would be rewarded," he said with a self-deprecating laugh. "That loyalty and competence would earn loyalty and recognition in return. It took a court-martial based on fabricated charges to teach me that idealism is a luxury that practical men cannot afford." Isabella understood then why Thorne commanded such absolute loyalty from his crew. He had been betrayed by the very institutions that should have valued his service, driven to piracy not by greed or bloodlust, but by the same kind of desperation that had brought her to the Siren's Rest Tavern. "What was your crime?" she asked gently. "I refused to falsify reports that would have covered up my superior's incompetence. Admiral Worthington had made tactical errors that cost us 3 ships and 200 men, but he needed someone to blame for the disaster. I was expendable, he was not." The bitterness in Thorne's voice was like acid, but beneath it Isabella heard something else, a wound that had never properly healed, a sense of injustice that still burned after all these years. "So you became everything they accused you of being." "I became what I needed to become to survive. Just as you have." The parallel was uncomfortably accurate. Isabella had indeed transformed herself from a proper young lady into someone who could lie convincingly to Spanish merchants and watch them be robbed without flinching. The question was whether such transformations represented discovery of hidden strength or corruption of essential character. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. Thorne was quiet for so long that Isabella thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "I regret the necessity of it, but not the freedom it brought me, or the men who follow me now because they choose to rather than because they're ordered to." As if summoned by his words, a gentle knock on the cabin door interrupted their conversation. James Fletcher's voice called through the wood. "Captain, sorry to disturb, but there's something you should ship on the horizon. Flying French colors, but sailing like she knows these waters too well for a legitimate trader." Thorne was on his feet instantly, the intimate mood of their dinner forgotten as his professional instincts took over. But he paused at the door, looking back at Isabella with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "We'll continue this conversation later," he promised. Isabella watched him go, then began clearing away the remains of their meal with hands that trembled slightly. She was falling in love with a pirate captain, and the realization terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. The blade sang through the morning air with deadly precision, its crimson steel catching the Caribbean sunlight like liquid fire. Captain Scarlett Morgaine wielded her famous cutlass with the fluid grace of a dancer, each movement calculated to intimidate as much as to threaten. The weapon had earned its reputation across the Spanish Main, having tasted the blood of countless enemies who had underestimated the woman who bore it. "Well, well," Scarlett purred as her ship, the Crimson Rose, drew alongside the Black Serpent. "If it isn't Thomas Blackwater, playing at being a pirate captain with his little English Rose. Isabella felt her stomach tighten at the obvious familiarity in Scarlet's voice. The rival captain was everything Isabella was not. Confident in her power, comfortable with violence, and clearly intimate with Thorne's past in ways that went far beyond professional acquaintance. Scarlet herself was a vision of predatory beauty, with raven black hair that flowed freely in the sea breeze and dark eyes that seemed to strip away pretense with surgical precision. Her clothing was practical but tailored to emphasize her feminine curves, while allowing for the quick movement that sword work required. Everything about her proclaimed that she was a woman who had seized power in a man's world and held it through superior skill and ruthless determination. "Scarlet," Thorne replied carefully, his voice neutral but his posture indicating readiness for violence. "What brings you to these waters?" "The same thing that always brings me anywhere, darling. Profit and pleasure, preferably combined." Scarlet's gaze shifted to Isabella with predatory interest. "Though I confess curiosity about your new crew member. She doesn't like your usual type." The insult was subtle but unmistakable, designed to establish dominance through the suggestion that Isabella was merely Thorne's latest conquest, rather than a valued member of his crew. Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to remain silent, understanding instinctively that any response would only reinforce Scarlet's implied superiority. "Isabella has proven herself invaluable," Thorne said firmly. "Her skills have made us all wealthier and safer." "Skills," Scarlet repeated, with amusement. "How wonderfully ambiguous. I'm sure she has many talents." The conversation was interrupted by the appearance of two British naval vessels on the horizon, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable even at a distance. Both pirate crews immediately shifted into professional mode, personal rivalries forgotten in the face of a common threat that could end with them all dancing at the end of a hangman's rope. "Patrol ships," Fletcher called from his position at the crow's nest, flying Admiral Worthington's flag, heading this way with purpose. The name sent a visible shock through Thorne's frame. Isabella remembered it from their intimate conversation. Worthington was the superior officer whose incompetence had cost Thorne his naval career and driven him to piracy. "Coincidence?" Scarlet asked, but her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Unlikely," Thorne replied grimly. "Someone's been talking to the Royal Navy about our activities. Then we have a choice," Scarlet said, all traces of mockery gone from her voice. "Run separately and hope one of us escapes, or work together and fight our way out." Isabella watched the two captains assess each other with the calculating gaze of natural predators forced into temporary alliance by circumstances beyond their control. The air between them crackled with tension that was part professional rivalry, part unresolved personal history, and part mutual recognition of matched abilities. "Your ship is faster," Thorne observed. "Your crew is larger," Scarlet countered. "The reef passage to the west, risky in this wind but possible if we coordinate our approach." Isabella found herself studying the interaction between Thorne and Scarlet with fascination and growing unease. They communicated with the efficiency of partners who had worked together many times before, finishing each other's tactical assessments and anticipating strategic considerations with an intimacy that spoke of shared experience in countless dangerous situations. "What's the plan?" Isabella asked, inserting herself into the conversation despite the risk of seeming presumptuous. Scarlet's attention fixed on her with renewed interest. "The plan, darling, is for experienced captains to navigate treacherous waters while passengers stay below deck and pray we all survive." The dismissal was deliberate and cutting, designed to establish that Isabella was an outsider to the deadly serious business of pirate warfare. But Thorne's response surprised everyone present. "Isabella stays on deck," he said firmly. "Her linguistic skills may prove essential if we encounter other vessels during our escape." Scarlet's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "How unexpectedly practical of you, Thomas." As both crews prepared for the dangerous maneuver that would either save their lives or lead them all to destruction, Isabella caught Scarlet watching her with speculative interest that was far more unsettling than open hostility would have been. The forged letter bore the elaborate wax seal of the governor of Jamaica, complete with the royal coat of arms pressed deep into red wax that had been artificially aged to suggest months of handling. To any casual observer, it appeared to be legitimate correspondence between colonial authorities, but Isabella's sharp eye had caught the subtle inconsistencies that marked it as an expertly crafted deception. "The paper is wrong," she said quietly to Thorne as they examined the document in the privacy of his cabin. "This is European manufacture, not the local paper that colonial offices use. And the ink, it's too fresh despite the artificial aging attempts." Marcus Webb, their quartermaster and a man Thorne had trusted for 3 years, had presented the letter as intelligence gathered during their last port visit. According to the document, Spanish treasure ships would be traveling a specific route with reduced escort, making them ideal targets for pirate raids. It was exactly the kind of information that had made their recent ventures so profitable. But Isabella's education in her father's business had included lessons in detecting forged documents, a necessary skill in maritime commerce where false papers could cost fortunes. The forgery was skillful enough to fool most people, but not someone trained to spot such deceptions. "If this is false," Thorne said slowly, "then someone wants us to attack those ships for reasons that have nothing to do with profit." Isabella nodded grimly. "It's a trap, but the question is whether Marcus is an idle participant or an unwitting messenger." The answer came sooner than either of them expected. James Fletcher appeared at the cabin door with an expression that warned of serious trouble. "Captain, we've got a problem. Found these hidden in Marcus's quarters." Fletcher held up a small bundle of correspondence, each letter bearing different seals, but all addressed to the same recipient, Admiral Worthington of His Majesty's Royal Navy. Thorne's face went ashen as he read the letters, each one detailing the Black Serpent's movements, crew complement, and planned activities with the precision of professional intelligence reports. Marcus had been feeding information to the British Navy for months, providing them with detailed accounts of every raid, every safe harbor, and every tactical decision. "How long has this been going on?" Isabella asked, though she dreaded the answer. "According to these dates, since before you joined us," Fletcher replied, which means my arrival was likely reported to Worthington within days." Isabella finished. "They know about me, about my skills, about everything." The implications were staggering. Not only had their recent successes been achieved despite having a spy in their midst, but every future plan would be compromised until Marcus was dealt with. Worse, the British Navy now possessed detailed intelligence about Isabella's capabilities and her value to Thorne's operation. "Where is he now?" Thorne asked, his voice carrying the deadly calm that his crew had learned to fear. "On deck, preparing the evening watch rotation. He doesn't know we've found his correspondence." Isabella felt sick as she considered what would happen next. In her former life, discovering that a trusted employee was stealing would have meant dismissal and possibly legal action. In the world she now inhabited, betrayal was a capital offense that would be settled with swift, violent justice. "There might be more," she said quietly. "If Marcus has been reporting to the Navy, he might not be the only one. This kind of operation usually requires multiple sources to be effective." Thorne nodded grimly. "We'll need to question the entire crew, but careful if there are others. We don't want to spook them into running before we can identify them all." The confrontation with Marcus took place in the ship's hold, away from the curious eyes of crew members who might still be loyal to the traitor. Isabella found herself present, not as a participant, but as a witness, her education and analytical skills needed to assess the reliability of whatever information Marcus might provide under pressure. Marcus Webb was 43 years old, a steady man who had served faithfully through countless dangerous situations. His betrayal seemed motivated not by greed, but by fear. The British had captured his younger brother during a previous raid and were holding him in a Nassau prison with the promise of execution if Marcus refused to cooperate. "They gave me a choice," Marcus said, his voice cracking under the weight of his confession. Betray my captain or watch my brother hang. What would you have done? It was a question that cut to the heart of the moral complexities that governed pirate life. Isabella understood that Marcus's choice had been between two forms of loyalty, each with devastating consequences for the people he cared about. But understanding didn't change the practical reality that his betrayal had put everyone aboard the Black Serpent at risk. The letters contained enough intelligence to allow the British Navy to set traps that could destroy them all. The ancient treasure map crackled like autumn leaves as Isabella carefully unfolded it on the rough wooden table in the abandoned pirate settlement. The parchment was yellow with age and marked with water stains, but the carefully drawn coastlines and cryptic symbols were still clearly visible. According to the faded inscription in the corner, it had been created by Captain Henry Morgan himself nearly 40 years earlier, marking the location of a cache that had never been recovered. "Look at these markings," Isabella said, tracing the intricate symbols with her fingers. "They're not random decorations, they're a cipher. Each symbol corresponds to a different measurement or direction." Thorne leaned closer, his shoulder brushing against hers as they studied the mysterious document together. The forced refuge on the hidden island had given them unexpected privacy, away from the crew's watchful eyes and the constant pressures of pirate life. For the first time since Isabella had joined his crew, they could interact simply as a man and woman drawn to each other, rather than as captain and subordinate navigating the complex dynamics of shipboard hierarchy. The island itself was a forgotten jewel, a crescent of white sand beaches and lush tropical vegetation that had once served as a pirate stronghold. The settlement's remains told the story of men who had tried to create something permanent in a profession defined by constant movement and danger. Stone foundations marked where buildings had once stood, while a freshwater spring provided the resource that had made the location valuable to seafaring raiders. Morgan was clever, Thorne observed, studying the map's intricate details. He used landmarks that would be recognizable to other pirates, but meaningless to naval authorities. These symbols reference things that only someone familiar with pirate traditions would understand. Isabella found herself captivated, not just by the puzzle of the treasure map, but by the intimacy of working so closely with Thorne. Away from his crew and the need to maintain his fearsome reputation, he revealed a different side of his personality. Scholarly, thoughtful, genuinely interested in her insights and observations. "The spring," she said suddenly, pieces of the cipher falling into place in her mind. "The symbol near the center of the map, it matches the carved stone beside the freshwater spring. Morgan used this place as his base, which means the treasure might still be here." They spent the afternoon exploring the island together, following the map's cryptic directions while learning more about each other than weeks of shipboard conversation had revealed. Thorne spoke of his childhood dreams of becoming an explorer, mapping unknown territories and discovering new lands for the glory of the British Empire. Isabella shared her secret ambition to write books about her travels, documenting the places and people she encountered with the detail of a natural historian. "You still could," Thorne said as they rested in the shade of a coconut palm. The treasure map spread between them like a promise of possibilities. "Write your books, I mean. This life we're living, it's worth recording. Future generations should know that not all pirates were mindless brutes, motivated only by greed." "And what about you?" Isabella asked. "What do you want to be remembered for?" Thorne was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the Black Serpent rode at anchor in the protected lagoon. "I want to be remembered as someone who refused to let betrayal and injustice break him. Someone who built something meaningful from the wreckage of his former life." As the sun began to set, painting the Caribbean sky in shades of gold and crimson, they made a discovery that neither the map nor their careful planning had prepared them for. Hidden beneath a fallen tree near the spring, they found not Morgan's legendary treasure, but something far more valuable, a cache of personal letters and documents that told the story of the pirates who had tried to make this island their home. The letters revealed men who had been more than simple criminals, who had formed genuine friendships and even attempted to create families despite the dangerous nature of their chosen profession. They had struggled with the same moral complexities that Isabella faced daily, trying to reconcile their actions with their consciences while building meaningful relationships in the shadow of constant danger. They were like us, Isabella whispered, reading a letter from a pirate to his wife, promising to retire from raiding and build a legitimate life once he had accumulated enough wealth to ensure their security. They were exactly like us, Thorne agreed, his voice carrying a weight of recognition that transformed the moment into something profound. As darkness fell around them, Isabella and Thorne found themselves alone together in a way that had never been possible aboard ship. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared before. Honest, intimate, and free from the careful boundaries that shipboard life required. The official naval orders bore Admiral Worthington's personal seal and signature, but it was the specific mention of Isabella's name that made Thorne's blood run cold. James Fletcher had intercepted the documents during a daring raid on a British courier vessel, and their contents revealed the true scope of the manhunt that was closing around them. "Listen to this," Fletcher said grimly, reading from the formal military correspondence. "All vessels under my command are hereby directed to prioritize the capture of the pirate vessel Black Serpent and her captain Thomas Blackwater, formerly Lieutenant Thomas Blackwater of His Majesty's Navy. Of particular interest is the female accomplice known as Isabella Crane, whose linguistic abilities and strategic insights have made the target significantly more dangerous to British shipping interests." Isabella felt the words hit her like physical blows. She had known intellectually that joining Thorne's crew would make her a criminal in the eyes of British law, but seeing her name written in official naval orders transformed her from anonymous fugitive to specifically targeted enemy of the crown. "There's more," Fletcher continued. "Admiral Worthington has been granted extraordinary authority to requisition ships and men from colonial governors throughout the Caribbean. He's assembling the largest pirate hunting force in the region's history, and it's all focused on capturing us." Thorne studied the documents with the analytical mind that had once served the same navy now pursuing him. The orders revealed tactical thinking that was both methodical and ruthless. Worthington intended to systematically eliminate every safe harbor, cut off every supply line, and corrupt every information source that pirates typically relied upon. "He's not just hunting us," Thorne realized. "He's restructuring the entire approach to pirate suppression in the Caribbean, using our crew as a test case for new strategies that could destroy pirate operations throughout the region." Isabella examined the documents more carefully, her education allowing her to parse the formal military language and understand the bureaucratic machinery that was being mobilized against them. What she discovered was even more disturbing than Fletcher's initial summary. "They know about our relationship," she said quietly. "Look at this section. They specifically mention that your attachment to me represents a vulnerability that can be exploited. They're planning to use me as bait." The strategy was diabolically simple and terrifyingly effective. By capturing Isabella, the British Navy could force Thorne into increasingly desperate and predictable actions as he attempted to rescue her. His tactical advantages would be negated by emotional attachment, making him vulnerable to traps that a purely rational opponent would easily avoid. "They're also offering rewards," Fletcher added grimly. £500 for information leading to our capture, with an additional 500 specifically for Miss Isabella's location. That's enough money to tempt pirates, who might otherwise stay neutral. The financial incentive transformed every port, every merchant, and every fellow pirate into a potential enemy. Isabella realized that her presence aboard the Black Serpent had not just made Thorne's crew more effective, it had made them exponentially more valuable targets. "We need to disappear," Isabella said, her practical mind cutting through the emotional implications to focus on immediate survival needs. "Change our appearance, alter our operational patterns, avoid every place we've been before." But Thorne was shaking his head even before she finished speaking. "Worthington knows me too well. He understands how I think tactically, which means standard evasion strategies won't work. He's counting on us to run, because running pirates make mistakes that stationary ones don't." Isabella studied the naval orders again, noting details that revealed the personal animosity driving Worthington's extraordinary pursuit. This wasn't simply about suppressing piracy. It was about settling old scores and demonstrating that betraying the Royal Navy carried consequences that would follow a man to the ends of the earth. "He mentions your court-martial specifically," she observed. "This is personal for him." "Very personal," Thorne confirmed. "I was the witness who could have exposed his incompetence and corruption. Driving me to piracy wasn't enough. He needs to capture me publicly to validate his version of what happened." The political dimensions of their situation were becoming clear. Worthington needed Thorne's capture, not just for military reasons, but to protect his own reputation and career. A successful conclusion to his pirate hunting expedition would cement his position within the Admiralty, while simultaneously eliminating the one person who knew the truth about his past failures. "What about the crew?" Isabella asked. "Do they know how dangerous our situation has become?" Fletcher nodded soberly. "They know we're being hunted, but not the full extent of the resources being deployed against us. Some of them are getting nervous about staying with a crew that's drawn this much official attention." The loyalty that had held Thorne's crew together through countless dangers was being tested by the unprecedented threat they now faced. The letter trembled in Isabella's hands as she sealed it with wax from Thorne's private candle, her elegant script covering 2 pages with words she prayed he would never have to read. She had written it in the pre-dawn darkness while he slept, knowing that what she planned to do would save his life while likely ending her own. "My dearest Thomas," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I will have surrendered myself to Admiral Worthington's forces. Please understand that this decision comes not from fear or doubt about our future together, but from absolute certainty about what that future requires. The British Navy wants me as bait to capture you, but they will settle for me as a prize if it means ending their most expensive manhunt in Caribbean history." Isabella had spent the night analyzing their impossible situation from every angle, applying the same logical reasoning that had made her valuable to Thorne's pirate operations. The mathematics of their survival were brutally simple. As long as she remained with the Black Serpent, the crew would be hunted by forces too large and well-equipped to evade indefinitely. Her sacrifice could buy Thorne and his men the time they needed to disappear into the vast Caribbean waters, where individual ships could vanish among thousands of islands and countless hiding places. She had planned her surrender carefully, studying the naval patrol patterns that Fletcher had been tracking for weeks. A British frigate made regular sweeps near the channel, where merchant vessels entered Port Royal's harbour, following a predictable schedule that would allow her to intercept them without endangering the Black Serpent or its crew. "I know you will want to rescue me," the letter continued, "and that knowledge will make every day of my captivity worthwhile. But I beg you to remember that my sacrifice means nothing if you throw your life away in a doomed rescue attempt. Live free, my darling, and remember that some forms of love require letting go rather than holding tighter." The rowing boat Isabella had commandeered from the ship's stores was barely seaworthy, but it would serve her purpose of reaching the British patrol vessel before Thorne discovered her absence. She had timed her departure to coincide with the changing of the watch, when the crew's attention would be focused on routine duties rather than monitoring their unusual passengers' movements. As she pulled away from the Black Serpent in the grey light of early dawn, Isabella allowed herself one final look at the ship that had become her home, and the man who had become her heart. Thorne stood silhouetted against the cabin window, still unaware that she was rowing toward captivity to purchase his freedom. The British frigate HMS Intrepid spotted her small boat when she was still half a mile from their position, their lookouts trained to watch for anything unusual in waters where pirates were known to operate. Isabella raised a white cloth tied to her oar, the traditional signal of surrender that would prevent them from simply sinking her boat as a potential threat. Captain Morrison of the Intrepid was a career naval officer whose methodical approach to duty had earned him steady advancement through the ranks without the brilliant victories that created legends. When his boarding party hauled Isabella from her makeshift boat, he initially assumed she was a refugee from some pirate attack, rather than the specific target that Admiral Worthington's orders had described. "I am Isabella Crane," she announced with quiet dignity as soon as she stood on the frigate's deck. I surrender myself voluntarily in exchange for the guarantee that no harm will come to the crew of the Black Serpent if they do not resist your authority." Morrison's expression shifted from mild curiosity to intense attention as he realized the significance of his unexpected prisoner. According to his orders, capturing Isabella Crane was nearly as valuable as taking the infamous Captain Blackwater himself, potentially worth a promotion and certainly worth substantial prize money. "Miss Crane," Morrison said carefully, "you understand that you are confessing to piracy and other crimes against the Crown. I understand that I am surrendering myself to prevent a battle that would cost lives on both sides." Isabella replied, "What happens to me afterward is less important than ensuring that good men are not forced to die for decisions that were mine alone." As the Intrepid changed course toward Port Royal and the confrontation with Admiral Worthington that would determine her fate, Isabella clutched her farewell letter and prayed that Thorne would understand her sacrifice as an act of love rather than betrayal. The morning sun climbed higher in the Caribbean sky, carrying her toward an uncertain future, while the Black Serpent grew smaller on the horizon behind her. The hairpin was little more than a slender piece of worked metal, unremarkable in every way except for the delicate rose engraving that had been her mother's trademark touch on all her personal jewelry. Isabella had worn it every day since her mother's death, a small reminder of the genteel life she had once known. Now, carefully bent and sharpened against the stone walls of her cell, it had become her most valuable possession, a tool of escape that her captors would never think to search for. Admiral Worthington's private mansion in Port Royal served as both his residence and unofficial headquarters for naval intelligence operations throughout the Caribbean. Isabella's imprisonment in the converted wine cellar was intended to be temporary, lasting only until Worthington could arrange the public trial and execution that would cement his reputation as the man who had finally brought the notorious Captain Blackwater to justice. But Isabella had not survived weeks among pirates by being passive in the face of danger. The education that had made her valuable to Thorne's crew now served her in analyzing the routines and weaknesses of her captive. She had spent 3 days observing the guard rotations, mapping the mansion's layout through overheard conversations, and identifying the political tensions that divided Worthington's staff. The Admiral himself had visited her cell twice, each time attempting to extract information about Thorne's plans and hideouts through a combination of threats and false promises. Isabella had maintained dignified silence during these interrogations, but she had also listened carefully to Worthington's comments about his strategic planning. "Your pirate captain will come for you," Worthington had said during his most recent visit, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed victory was inevitable. "His sentimental attachment to you will override his tactical judgment, just as his idealism once blinded him to political realities. When he attempts your rescue, my forces will be waiting with overwhelming numbers and superior position." The trap being set for Thorne was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. Isabella's public imprisonment would draw him into attempting a rescue that would require approaching Port Royal's heavily defended harbor, where naval vessels and shore batteries could concentrate their fire on the Black Serpent. Even Thorne's superior seamanship and tactical brilliance would be useless against such overwhelming odds. But Isabella had discovered something during her careful observation of the mansion's routines. Worthington's confidence had made him careless about security details that a more paranoid man would have considered essential. The guards assigned to watch her were colonial militia rather than professional naval marines, men who viewed prisoner duty as tedious routine rather than critical responsibility. More importantly, she had identified an ally among Worthington's household staff. Maria Santos was a middle-aged woman whose husband had been impressed into naval service against his will, leaving her to support 3 children through domestic work for British officers. Her resentment toward the colonial authorities that had destroyed her family made her sympathetic to anyone who opposed their power. Isabella had begun communicating with Maria through coded messages passed during meal deliveries, using her knowledge of Spanish to convey information that the English-speaking guards could not intercept. The conversations revealed that Maria had access to areas of the mansion that were not regularly patrolled, including passages that connected to the harbor district where escape might be possible. The Admiral planned something special for tomorrow evening, Maria whispered during one of her visits, pretending to collect Isabella's dinner tray. A reception for colonial officials to celebrate his success in capturing the dangerous pirate woman. Many guests, much wine, guards distracted by serving duties. The reception represented Isabella's best opportunity for escape, but it also meant that she had limited time to warn Thorne about the trap being prepared for him. According to the conversations she had overheard, British naval patrols had already spotted the Black Serpent approaching Port Royal's outer waters, confirming Worthington's prediction that Thorne would attempt a rescue mission. Working by candlelight in her cell, Isabella used her modified hairpin to pick the simple lock that secured her door, a skill she had never imagined needing but which her father's business dealings had occasionally required when dealing with stubborn cargo containers. The lock mechanism was old and poorly maintained, yielding to patient manipulation by someone who understood the basic principles of mechanical engineering. As she prepared for her escape attempt, Isabella carried with her not just the hairpin that would free her from captivity, but also crucial intelligence about British naval dispositions that could save Thorne's life. She had memorized ship positions, patrol schedules, and tactical plans that would allow the Black Serpent to avoid the trap that Worthington had spent weeks preparing. The signet ring had belonged to Thorne's father, a respected ship's captain who had served the crown with honor for 30 years before dying in service to a nation that would later betray his son. The gold band bore the Blackwater family crest, an anchor crossed with a sword, symbolizing duty and courage, but now Thorne pressed it into warm wax to forge the official seal of a British naval officer who had never existed. Commander Jonathan Sterling, Thorne murmured as he carefully crafted the false identity documents that would allow him to infiltrate Admiral Worthington's reception. The fictional officer's service record, complete with forged commendations and transfer orders, represented months of careful preparation by a network of sympathetic forgers and corrupt clerks who operated in the shadows of colonial bureaucracy. James Fletcher watched his captain work with the focused intensity of a master craftsman, applying skills learned during his legitimate naval service to create documents that would pass even careful inspection. The irony was not lost on either man. Thorne was using his military training to forge the very papers that would allow him to strike at the heart of British naval power in the Caribbean. "The uniform fits well enough," Fletcher observed, adjusting the gold braid on Thorne's borrowed commander's jacket. "But are you certain about going in alone? If something goes wrong, the crew needs to be far away from Port Royal when it happens." Thorne replied firmly, "This isn't a mission for the Black Serpent. It's something I have to do personally." The plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Thorne would present himself at Worthington's reception as a visiting naval officer, using his intimate knowledge of military protocol and his natural command presence to blend in among the colonial officials and naval officers who would be celebrating Isabella's capture. Once inside the Admiral's mansion, he would locate Isabella and extract her during the confusion of the evening's festivities. The forged documents were masterpieces of deception, complete with travel orders that explained Commander Sterling's presence in Port Royal and recommendations from superior officers whose signatures had been carefully copied from legitimate correspondence. But the most crucial element of Thorne's disguise was not the papers or the uniform. It was his ability to project the confident authority of a career naval officer who belonged in such company. "Remember," Fletcher said as they made final preparations, "Worthington knew you as Lieutenant Blackwater, not Captain. Your appearance has changed enough over the years that recognition shouldn't be immediate. But don't take unnecessary risks." Thorne nodded, understanding that his former superior's personal knowledge of him was both an advantage and a danger. Worthington would be expecting the idealistic young officer he had once betrayed, not the hardened pirate captain who had learned to think tactically about deception and violence. The mansion was ablaze with lights when Thorne arrived, its windows glowing warmly against the Caribbean evening as carriages deposited guests at the main entrance. Colonial society's elite had gathered to celebrate what they believed was a significant victory against the pirate threat that had plagued their shipping for years. Thorne presented his forged papers to the reception clerk with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to such formalities. The documents passed their first test without question, earning him entry to a gathering where his presence represented mortal danger to everyone involved. Commander Sterling, he introduced himself to various guests, using conversations about naval affairs and colonial politics to map the mansion's layout, while searching for any sign of Isabella's location. His military bearing and knowledge of current events made him a convincing addition to the evening's company, even as he planned actions that would transform celebration into catastrophe. The intelligence he gathered during the reception confirmed his worst fears about the trap that had been prepared for the Black Serpent. Naval vessels were positioned throughout the harbor approaches, while shore batteries had been reinforced with additional cannon and experienced gunners. Any conventional rescue attempt would have been suicidal. But Thorne's approach was far from conventional. As the evening progressed and wine loosened tongues throughout the gathering, he learned crucial details about security arrangements and guard rotations that would allow him to reach Isabella without alerting the broader defensive network. The moment of greatest risk came when Admiral Worthington himself approached, drawn by curiosity about the visiting commander, whose name he didn't recognize from recent correspondence with the Admiralty. "Commander Sterling," Worthington said with the polite interest of a superior officer meeting a subordinate. "I don't believe we've been introduced. What brings you to Port Royal?" Thorne met his former superior's gaze with the steady confidence of his assumed identity, knowing that recognition would mean immediate death for both himself and Isabella. The battle flag snapped proudly in the Caribbean wind, its redesigned emblem telling a story that every member of Thorne's crew could read like a beloved book. Where the Black Serpent had once flown a simple skull and crossbones, now a more complex symbol dominated the black silk, a serpent coiled around an anchor with a rose blooming from the crown of thorns that encircled both. It was Isabella's design, incorporating elements that represented both their individual histories and their united future. "The lads have been asking questions about the new flag," James Fletcher reported as he joined Thorne at the helm. "They want to know what it means for our operations going forward." Isabella stood beside them both, no longer the desperate refugee who had begged for work in Port Royal's taverns, but a woman who commanded respect through proven competence and unwavering courage. Her escape from Admiral Worthington's custody had become legend among the crew, while her tactical contributions during their recent battles had earned her a position that transcended the unofficial arrangements of their early relationship. "It means we're no longer just another pirate crew stealing what we can and hoping to survive until tomorrow," Thorne replied, his eyes on the horizon where other ships were beginning to gather in response to the signals he had sent throughout the Caribbean. "We're building something that will outlast all of us." The alliance forming around the Black Serpent represented the most ambitious pirate confederation in Caribbean history. Captain Scarlett Morgaine had put aside personal rivalries to bring her crew into the growing partnership, recognizing that individual survival required collective action against the increasing British naval presence. Other captains were arriving daily, drawn by reports of successful raids and the promise of systematic resistance to colonial authority. Isabella had played a crucial role in negotiating these alliances, her linguistic skills and diplomatic background, allowing her to communicate with Spanish, French, and Dutch pirates whose cooperation was essential for large-scale operations. But more than translation, she brought strategic thinking that transformed random acts of piracy into coordinated campaigns with clear objectives. "The British have changed their tactics," Isabella observed, studying the intelligence reports that arrived daily from their network of informants throughout the colonial territories. "Worthington's approach to pirate suppression is becoming the standard model for all Caribbean naval operations. If we don't adapt, we'll be hunted to extinction within 2 years." The transformation of pirate strategy required unprecedented cooperation between crews that had traditionally operated as fierce competitors. Isabella's proposal involved coordinated attacks on British supply lines, shared intelligence about naval movements, and mutual defense agreements that would make it impossible for colonial authorities to eliminate pirate operations through divide-and-conquer tactics. "The flag represents our commitment to each other," Isabella explained to the assembled captains during their strategic planning session. "Not just as temporary allies, but as partners in creating something that the British Empire cannot destroy through conventional military action." The political dimensions of their enterprise were becoming clear to everyone involved. This was no longer simple piracy motivated by individual greed, but organized resistance to colonial oppression that threatened to inspire similar movements throughout the Caribbean. The economic implications alone were staggering. Coordinated pirate activity could disrupt British trade routes and challenge the colonial monopolies that funded imperial expansion. Thorne watched Isabella address the gathering of pirate captains with pride that went far beyond romantic attachment. She had evolved from reluctant participant in their criminal activities to strategic architect of a movement that could reshape the balance of power in the Caribbean. Her education and background gave her credibility with diverse audiences, while her proven courage in dangerous situations earned respect from men who valued practical competence above all other qualifications. "The question we must answer," Isabella continued, "is whether we want to remain criminals hiding in the shadows of history or become revolutionaries who challenge unjust authority through organized action. The choice will determine not just our individual survival, but the legacy we leave for future generations who dream of freedom from colonial oppression." The response from the assembled captains was immediate and enthusiastic. These were men who had chosen dangerous lives, partly from necessity but also from rejection of the limited options that colonial society offered to those without wealth or aristocratic connection. Isabella's vision gave meaning to their rebellion, transforming it from desperate criminality into principled resistance. As the sun set on their planning session, the new battle flag flew above a fleet that represented the largest gathering of pirate vessels in Caribbean history. But more than numerical strength, the alliance possessed something that previous pirate confederations had lacked: unified purpose and strategic leadership that could sustain coordinated action beyond individual raids. The war for Caribbean freedom was about to begin, and Isabella Crane had become one of its primary architects. The cannon roared with thunderous authority as Isabella personally triggered the firing mechanism, sending 18 pounds of iron death screaming toward the British frigate that had dared to challenge their flagship. The crew had christened the weapon Isabella's Fury, in honor of the woman who had transformed from desperate refugee to battle-hardened warrior, and its deadly accuracy in the heat of combat was already becoming the stuff of Caribbean legend. "Direct hit on their mainmast," Fletcher shouted above the chaos of battle, his voice barely audible over the sounds of splintering wood and screaming metal that filled the air around the embattled pirate fleet. The confrontation that Isabella had spent months planning was finally underway, with 12 pirate vessels arranged in a tactical formation that maximized their advantages while minimizing the superior firepower of Admiral Worthington's naval squadron. Isabella's strategic brilliance was evident in every aspect of the battle: the choice of location that limited British maneuverability, the timing that caught the naval forces during a supply rotation, and the coordination between captains who had never worked together before. Admiral Worthington himself commanded the engagement from the deck of HMS Retribution, a ship of the line whose 74 guns represented more firepower than the entire pirate fleet combined. But Isabella had anticipated this advantage, designing a battle plan that relied on speed and tactical flexibility rather than attempting to match British firepower directly. "Signal Captain Scarlet to begin her flanking maneuver," Isabella commanded, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had studied this moment in her mind countless times before experiencing it in reality. "And tell Captain Morrison to prepare the fire ships. We'll need them if Worthington tries to close formation." Thorne fought beside her at the Black Serpent's helm, his naval training perfectly complementing her strategic innovations as they maneuvered through waters that ran red with blood and black with powder smoke. The partnership that had begun with desperate attraction had evolved into something far more powerful, two minds working in perfect harmony to achieve objectives that neither could have accomplished alone. The tide of battle shifted dramatically when Isabella's Fury scored a devastating hit on HMS Intrepid's ammunition storage, triggering an explosion that lit the Caribbean sky like a second sun. The blast sent debris raining down across both fleets, while the shockwave knocked men from their feet and temporarily silenced the cannons on nearby vessels. Worthington's breaking formation. Thorne called out, his experienced eye reading the tactical situation as British ships began to scatter in response to the catastrophic loss of one of their primary vessels. He's trying to preserve his remaining force rather than risk total destruction. But Isabella had anticipated this retreat as well, positioning her fastest ships to intercept British vessels that attempted to flee the engagement. Captain Scarlet's Crimson Rose struck like a shark among minnows, her superior seamanship allowing her to systematically cripple British ships that found themselves isolated from mutual support. The personal dimension of the conflict became clear when Admiral Worthington's flagship Retribution closed to boarding range with the Black Serpent, bringing the two former naval officers face to face in direct combat for the first time since Thorne's disgrace and exile years earlier. Thomas Blackwater, Worthington's voice carried across the narrowing gap between their ships, loaded with years of hatred and frustrated ambition. "Today I finish what your court-martial should have accomplished." Isabella watched Thorne's expression transform as he prepared to confront the man whose betrayal had destroyed his naval career and driven him to piracy. But this was not the idealistic young lieutenant who had once served under Worthington's command. This was a battle-hardened captain whose tactical abilities had been sharpened by years of survival among the most dangerous waters in the world. The boarding action that followed was brutal and personal, with both crews fighting not just for victory, but for the right to determine which version of history would be remembered. Isabella found herself defending the quarterdeck with pistol and cutlass, her refined education no match for the savage realities of hand-to-hand combat at sea. But she had learned from the best teachers, men whose lives depended on their ability to fight effectively in impossible situations. Her movements were economical and deadly, each strike calculated to disable opponents with minimum wasted effort. As the battle reached its crescendo, Isabella's Fury spoke one final time, its massive projectile smashing through the Retribution's stern windows to detonate in Admiral Worthington's private cabin. The explosion shattered the British flagship's ability to coordinate their remaining forces, leaving individual captains to fight desperately for survival rather than following any coherent tactical plan. Victory belonged to the pirates, but the cost had been higher than anyone anticipated. The ship's charter lay spread across the captain's table, its formal language carefully crafted to establish what had never existed before in Caribbean pirate history. A legal document recognizing a woman as equal commander of a pirate vessel. Isabella's name appeared alongside Thorne's in elegant script, both signatures carrying identical authority over the Black Serpent and her crew of battle-hardened survivors. By unanimous consent of the crew, James Fletcher read aloud from the document, his voice carrying the solemnity of a man participating in history. Isabella Crane is hereby recognized as co-captain of the vessel Black Serpent, with all rights, privileges and responsibilities pertaining to that rank. The ceremony was taking place in a hidden lagoon where the surviving pirate fleet had gathered to assess their losses and celebrate their unprecedented victory over British naval forces. Of the 12 vessels that had entered battle against Admiral Worthington's squadron, 9 remained seaworthy, with the others reduced to floating wreckage or lying beneath Caribbean waters alongside too many good men who would never see another sunrise. But the tactical victory had achieved something far more significant than simple survival. It had demonstrated that organized pirate resistance could defeat professional naval forces when properly coordinated and intelligently led. News of the battle was already spreading throughout the Caribbean, inspiring other pirate crews while sending shockwaves through colonial administrations that had believed their naval superiority was unassailable. Isabella stood before the assembled crew with quiet dignity, her appearance bearing the honorable scars of someone who had fought alongside them in desperate combat rather than merely commanding from safety. A cutlass wound across her left forearm testified to her personal courage during the boarding action with HMS Retribution, while powder burns on her hands showed that she had served her beloved cannon throughout the engagement. "I never sought this position," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly across the lagoon, where other pirate crews had gathered to witness this historic moment. "6 months ago, I was a starving refugee begging for work in Port Royal's taverns. Today, I stand before you as proof that circumstances can transform anyone into something they never imagined becoming." The response from the assembled pirates was immediate and enthusiastic. These were men who had followed her tactical leadership through the most dangerous battle of their lives, watching her prove that courage and intelligence mattered more than gender, when survival hung in the balance. Her elevation to co-captain represented recognition of demonstrated competence rather than sentimental gesture. Thorne watched the proceedings with pride that transcended any romantic attachment he felt for Isabella. She had earned this recognition through actions that had saved lives and secured victory against overwhelming odds. More importantly, her official elevation would formalize the strategic partnership that had made their recent successes possible. The traditional ceremony requires each crew member to affirm their loyalty to the new captain, Fletcher explained, producing the ornate cutlass that had belonged to the Black Serpent's previous captain. "Will you accept this blade as symbol of your authority and responsibility to those who serve under your command?" Isabella took the weapon with hands that showed no tremor, understanding that she was accepting not just ceremonial recognition but the deadly serious obligation to lead men whose lives depended on her tactical decision. The cutlass was beautifully crafted, its blade engraved with nautical symbols and its handle wrapped in leather that had been darkened by years of Caribbean service. "I accept this responsibility," Isabella replied formally, "and swear by my honor and my life to serve the interests of this crew and the cause of freedom in Caribbean waters." The oath was traditionally masculine in its language, but Isabella's delivery transformed it into something universal, a promise that transcended gender, to focus on the essential relationship between leader and follower that made pirate crews effective fighting forces. Captain Scarlett Morgaine, whose own presence represented the grudging respect of a woman who had fought for recognition in an exclusively male profession, stepped forward to offer her congratulations. "Welcome to a very exclusive sisterhood," Scarlett said with genuine warmth, embracing Isabella with the fierce affection of someone who understood the challenges that lay ahead. "There are perhaps 3 women in all the Caribbean who command fighting ships. Now there are 4, and the British Empire has 4 times as much to fear." As the sun set over their hidden anchorage, Isabella stood at the bow of the Black Serpent, wearing the cutlass that marked her new rank, studying charts that showed potential targets for their expanding operations. The charter that formalized her position also established new precedents that would influence pirate culture throughout the Caribbean, opening possibilities for other capable individuals, regardless of their background or gender. The wedding ring gleamed in the Caribbean sunset, its surface reflecting the golden light, while the Spanish gold from which it had been forged told the story of their shared adventures. Thorne had commissioned the piece from a master goldsmith in Tortuga, using treasure they had captured together during their first successful raid on the San Carlos months earlier. The circular band bore no precious stones or elaborate decoration. Its beauty lay in the simple perfection of its craftsmanship and the profound commitment it represented. "Do you, Thomas Blackwater, take this woman as your wife and equal partner in all endeavors, whether they lead to fortune or disaster, glory or disgrace?" Captain Scarlett Morgaine asked, her voice carrying the ceremonial weight of someone performing a ritual that had been adapted from naval tradition to suit the unique requirements of pirate society. "I do," Thorne replied, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face as he placed the ring on her finger with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of the moment. In calm seas and storms, in prosperity and want, in freedom and captivity, Isabella felt the metal warm against her skin, a tangible symbol of the transformation that had carried her from desperate starvation to this moment of perfect happiness. The woman who had begged for work in Port Royal's taverns had died somewhere during the months of adventure and danger that followed, replaced by someone stronger and more complete than she had ever imagined possible. And do you, Isabella Crane, take this man as your husband and equal partner, accepting both his protection and his vulnerability, his strengths and his failures? Scarlett continued, her own experience as a woman commanding respect in a masculine world, adding authority to the traditional words. I do, Isabella replied, her voice clear and strong as she slipped a matching band onto Thorne's finger. In battle and peace, in leadership and service, in love and friendship. The ceremony was taking place aboard the Black Serpent at anchor in a secluded bay, with representatives from allied pirate crews serving as witnesses to vows that would bind together not just two individuals, but the strategic partnership that had revolutionized Caribbean piracy. The deck had been decorated with tropical flowers and captured silk banners, transforming the deadly warship into something approaching a cathedral. James Fletcher stepped forward with the ship's logbook, officially recording the marriage in the same careful script that documented their raids and battles. Let it be noted that on this day, Captain Thomas Blackwater and Captain Isabella Crane were joined in matrimony according to the laws of the sea, with all rights and privileges pertaining thereto. The legal implications were significant in ways that extended far beyond romantic sentiment. Under pirate law, Isabella now possessed equal claim to everything Thorne owned, including his ship and his share of their collective treasure. More importantly, she could speak with his full authority in any situation where he was absent or incapacitated, ensuring continuity of command that could mean the difference between survival and destruction for their crew. Kiss the bride, someone shouted from the assembled crew, and the formal solemnity of the ceremony dissolved into celebration as Thorne pulled Isabella into his arms with passionate enthusiasm that drew cheers from men who had risked their lives following both captains into battle. The feast that followed was as elaborate as resources and circumstances allowed, with captured Spanish wine flowing freely while the ship's cook prepared delicacies that would have graced the tables of colonial governors. Music filled the tropical night as crew members who possessed instruments provided entertainment for dancing and singing that continued until dawn. But beyond the celebration, Isabella and Thorne spent quiet moments discussing the expansion of their maritime empire that their partnership had made possible. Intelligence reports from throughout the Caribbean indicated that their victory over Admiral Worthington had inspired other pirate crews to adopt more aggressive and coordinated tactics against colonial shipping. We've created something that will outlive both of us, Thorne observed as they watched the sunrise from the captain's cabin that they now officially shared. The British will never again be able to suppress Caribbean piracy through conventional naval power alone. Isabella nodded, understanding that their personal happiness was inseparable from the larger political transformation they had helped to create. The question is whether we can maintain unity among the crews long enough to establish permanent changes in the balance of power. The challenges ahead were formidable, requiring sustained cooperation between pirate captains whose natural instincts favored independence over collective action. But Isabella's diplomatic skills and Thorne's tactical expertise provided the foundation for leadership that could navigate such complex political waters. As the Black Serpent prepared to depart their hidden anchorage for new adventures, the Spanish gold ring caught the morning light, like a promise of adventures yet to come. The leather-bound captain's log bore Isabella's name embossed in gold letters across its cover, a testament to how completely she had transformed from desperate refugee to legendary pirate leader. 6 months had passed since her wedding to Thorne, and the pages within documented adventures that would be told in Caribbean taverns for generations to come. Her elegant handwriting filled each entry with the careful attention to detail that had made her invaluable as both strategist and historian of their remarkable partnership. Another Spanish treasure fleet avoided our patrol routes entirely, Isabella wrote in her latest entry, the ink still wet as she documented the profound changes their alliance had brought to Caribbean commerce. Colonial merchants now factor pirate insurance into their shipping costs, while naval commanders request additional escorts for routes that were considered safe just 1 year ago. We have fundamentally altered the economic calculations that govern maritime trade throughout the region. The Black Serpent rode at anchor in a natural harbor that had become the unofficial capital of what colonial governments now called the Pirate Republic of the Caribbean. 7 major crews had established permanent bases around the protected lagoon, creating a community that blended the democratic traditions of pirate society with the organizational sophistication that Isabella's education had brought to their collective efforts. Thorne approached her writing desk with the easy familiarity of a man who had learned to share both command decisions and domestic intimacy with a woman whose capabilities perfectly complemented his own. Their partnership had evolved beyond the romantic attraction that had initially drawn them together, developing into something that was part marriage, part military alliance, and part revolutionary collaboration. The latest intelligence from Port Royal confirms what we suspected, Thorne said, settling into the chair beside her desk. The British are withdrawing their most valuable shipping from Caribbean routes entirely. They're routing treasure fleets through the Pacific rather than risk confrontation with our alliance. Isabella paused in her writing to consider the strategic implications of this development. Their success had been so complete that it was forcing fundamental changes in how European powers approached New World commerce, with effects that would ripple through global trade patterns for decades to come. Which means we've accomplished something unprecedented, she replied thoughtfully. We've actually won, not just individual battles or raids, but the larger war for control of Caribbean waters. The victory was more profound than simple military conquest, by proving that organized pirate resistance could successfully challenge colonial naval power. Isabella and Thorne had inspired similar movements throughout the Americas. Reports arrived regularly describing pirate alliances forming along the North American coast, in South American waters, and even in the Indian Ocean, where European colonial expansion was facing increasingly sophisticated resistance. The crew wants to know what comes next, Thorne said. Now that we've achieved everything we originally set out to accomplish, what do we do with the power we've accumulated? It was a question that Isabella had been contemplating for weeks as their influence continued to grow. The Pirate Alliance now controlled territory that functioned as an independent nation, complete with its own laws, currency and diplomatic relationships with colonial governors who preferred negotiation to warfare. They had created something that transcended piracy to become a legitimate alternative to European colonial rule. We build something permanent, Isabella said finally, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who dreams of freedom from colonial oppression. We've proven that alternatives to imperial rule are possible. Now we have to demonstrate that they're sustainable. The conversation was interrupted by James Fletcher, whose role had evolved from first mate to something approaching foreign minister as their political responsibilities expanded beyond simple piracy. He carried correspondence from colonial governors, merchant associations, and even European courts that were beginning to recognize the practical necessity of dealing diplomatically with the Caribbean's new power structure. Captain Isabella, Fletcher said, using the title that had become natural among crew members who respected her authority equally with Thorne's. We've received formal diplomatic recognition from the French colonial administration. They're proposing a trade agreement that would give us legal status as an independent maritime nation. Isabella felt a profound sense of completion as she considered this ultimate validation of their revolutionary achievements. The desperate woman who had begged for work in Port Royal's taverns had become the co-founder of a new nation, her journey from starvation to sovereignty serving as inspiration for countless others who refused to accept the limitations that circumstances seemed to impose. As the Caribbean sun set behind them, Isabella opened her captain's log to record the day's events. her elegant script documenting the continuing transformation of two people who had discovered that love and revolution were sometimes the same thing.